Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. Um, Both our existing Logic subscribers and people who are checking this out with maybe the intention of subscribing at some point. Um, Let me tell you a little bit about The Logic. The Logic is an independent news publication that reports on Canadian business and tech, covering everything from electric vehicles to crypto to what's happening in Ottawa. In addition to our reporting in daily newsletters, subscribers also get exclusive access to monthly insider events, company sentiment analysis, community surveys, Slack channels, and job postings. My name is Murad Hemmadi. I'm a reporter and one of the Ottawa correspondents here at The Logic, and we're here today to talk a little bit about privacy. In the 2010s, it became fashionable to say that people, young people in particular, didn't care about privacy, that consumers were willing to click yes to any terms of service you put in front of them, as long as the social platform, online store, or video stream on the other side of that form was compelling enough. Robust survey work suggests that was never true. People aren't unconcerned, they're just confused by long terms of service full of legalese and all those cookies pop ups you see all over the internet. It's not privacy indifference, it's privacy fatigue. And a long string of data breaches has reinforced the sense that consumers have something to fear. In 2022 alone, organizations that made headlines because of incidents involving personal information included IKEA Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. So that's where you buy your furniture, the citizen services you get, and where you donate your money, all in a single year. So that's the cloud. The silver lining is all the stuff organizations can do with data if they have the right permissions and technology. The new federal privacy commissioner, Philippe Dufresne, says privacy is not an obstacle to innovation. Our panelists are all working to prove that. Hanging over all of this is a fragmented regulatory landscape and the prospect of change, with a long delayed consumer privacy bill working its way through Parliament. Now that's enough throat clearing, and you might hear me do a little bit more of that today. My apologies, I'm coming off the flu. But I wanted to just encourage you as we're going through this to ask questions. You can do that in the chat or under the question section at the bottom right hand of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible throughout the discussion. I'd like to thank our partner TELUS for making this event possible and for its continued support in fostering meaningful discussions like this one. Joining us from TELUS to provide opening remarks is Pam Snively, Chief Data and Trust Officer. She leads the team responsible for privacy governance and data ethics, along with data management and a number of other compliance functions, including the anti-bribery and corruption and competition law programs. Pam is a lawyer, but has dedicated most of her career to developing and operationalizing privacy best practices, either as a consultant or in-house. Let me turn it over to Pam.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Murad. I'm honored to be joining you here today from the beautiful traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Murad, it's a pleasure to be here to help kick off a conversation about the intersection between data privacy, innovation, and social good, and to collect insights from my peers across private, public, and legal sectors. Central to the discussion today is trust. Trust is facing new challenges. Modern society is built on trust. We trust that the bus driver will get us where we're going safely and that other drivers on the road will follow the rules. We trust that institutions will treat us fairly. Trust is the societal glue that facilitates so many interactions, big and small, in a democracy. When trust erodes, it leads to the polarization we see today, the loss of a shared understanding of reliable facts, and a loss of confidence in institutions. If trust breaks down, it threatens democracy itself. We all have a stake in fostering trust. In today's data environment, there's a proliferation of misinformation and a corresponding dearth of balanced, reliable information about data best practices. Privacy-enhancing technologies and governance programs are poorly understood. Sound data governance is not an interesting media story, but breaches, creepy technology, and misuse of data are. They should be, as they help individuals determine who to trust and how much to trust in the digital ecosystem. But they contribute to the trust deficit in a worrisomely unbalanced way, as we rarely hear about good players or programs. The current trust deficit is challenging us to find new solutions to generate trust in the digital environment. New solutions are critically important because we need a safe space to innovate, safe for the innovators, a trusted space, and also safe for all stakeholders, a trustworthy space. Trustworthy solutions and trusted solutions. Without that safe space, our ability to innovate and do good for all will be hampered. There is reason for optimism, but we have to work for it. The good news is that Canadians told us in a recent survey that they're optimistic about technology positively impacting their lives, particularly in healthcare, education, safety, and security. To deliver on that, we need their trust and buy-in because it's absolutely possible for organizations to innovate and leverage data insights for society's benefit while maintaining individual privacy. This panel in particular knows that well. We all know the potential of data is enormous. Used responsibly, data can help governments and businesses make important decisions based on facts, not assumptions. Those decisions might be used to help plan safer and more sustainable cities, improve healthcare, or countless other things. The trust is more important than ever before, and it's an important component of the social license to innovate. When we earn more trust, we gain access to better quality data, people trust us with their data, and broader license to use that data, which gives us the opportunity to develop and deliver better, smarter, innovative solutions for our customers, our communities, and frankly, our planet. Right now, Canadians are not necessarily convinced of the value of data-fueled technology. And as industry, we can do more. We can do better. A recent survey that TELUS commissioned found that nearly 8 in 10 Canadians feel that a company's reputation for how it treats personal information and privacy changes the way they think about the company or brand. That's huge. That's very powerful information. Many of us who innovate in the data space recognize that data can be used for socially beneficial purposes, but it's important to note that the technology and applications are not as familiar to the public, not always. When organizations are open about what they are doing, when they demonstrate respect for the individual and are clear and transparent about how they intend to use the data, consumers are more comfortable sharing their data with them. Transparency builds trust and allows all of us to feel more informed and secure in our daily interactions. At TELUS, we like to say that doing good is good for business. We talk a lot about our social purpose, but none of that is possible without trust. What is absolutely critical here is to build transparent, sustainable, responsible data practices into every function of our organizations, but also to communicate that work to our teams, our customers, and our shareholders. Organizations need to consider every touch point with stakeholders and the opportunities to build something better alongside them. Using data for social good, for social purpose, cannot come out of a vacuum. Data ethics are inextricably bound to the overall social purpose posture of an organization. You cannot separate your organization's data practices from its other actions. There's only one brand in the eyes of customers, investors, and regulators. We're here today because I believe, as we at TELUS believe, that there's a lot to be gained from open conversations around data, trust, and innovation. There are incredibly smart leaders at this table with different points of view, and I'm so excited to hear what they have to say. And now back to you, Murad. I look forward to the insights that will be generated from the discussion.
Thanks so much, Pam. So let me introduce you to our panel, who will be doing most of the talking today. So Abigail Carter-Langford is Chief Privacy and Security Officer, Executive Vice President of Governance, Risk and Compliance at Canada Health Infoway. Abigail joined Infoway in 2017 to promote Infoway's commitment to addressing health information governance, including the privacy and security of personal health information throughout the digital health industry and within Infoway. Samara Starkman is a partner of INQ Data Law and INQ Consulting, where her practice concentrates on privacy, data governance, health, and technology. Prior to joining the INQ organization, Samara was a sole practitioner where her clients included major Ontario hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, health tech startups, and multinational telecommunications companies. And finally, Patricia Thaine is the co-founder and CEO of Private AI, which is aptly named for our discussion. She's also a computer science PhD candidate at the University of Toronto on leave and a Vector Institute alumna. Her R&D work is focused on privacy-preserving natural language processing with a focus on applied cryptography and re-identification risk. Please join me in welcoming them all to the stage virtually. Thanks so much. All of you for being here. So Samara of Inc., as I had forgotten along the way, Inc. of Inquiry. I wanted to start with you because I think it's useful here to define our terms. We're going to be talking about privacy a lot during this conversation. But when you're working with clients, what does privacy mean? Is privacy keeping everything under wraps? Like, what are we talking about when we talk about privacy?
I think that's a really great question and a good place to start. So thank you for that introduction and for having me. I think Pam did a fabulous job in talking about what privacy is, really. And we're talking about trust. So, even in your intro, Murad, you talked about privacy in different ways. And we use that term so often as if we all have a common and shared understanding of what it means. And we don't. We all use it differently and we all feel differently about it. So when you hear privacy is dead, what does that mean? I think, to some, it does mean keeping everything confidential. For others, and I think probably most of us in this panel, and like Pam talked about, it's providing and empowering individuals to have choice over what's done with their personal information through transparency. So I think a lot of our discussion today centers around how we're engendering trust through transparency, choice for individuals about what's happening with their personal information. And part of that is knowing when personal information doesn't need to be used in an identifiable format in order to gain the benefits. So we look at it from, privacy being about choice, and it really does come down to trust ultimately.
Patricia, I know a lot of your business is, in fact, that question of when, information needs to be personally identifiable and when it doesn't. How does that play into the work that you do with clients?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of the times, the way that you treat personally identifiable information can really make your life much harder or much easier down the line. And data protection regulations tend to have a clause that say that you have to minimize the amount of personal information that you are collecting to only what you need. Oftentimes, you don't need personally identifiable information to accomplish certain tasks. If you look at AI tasks, for example, you don't need personally identifiable information to do topic modeling or sentiment analysis or understanding how well a customer conversation went. So the way that we work with our customers is in helping them identify the types of personally identifiable information that they have in really messy data, and allowing them to choose what it is that they actually need, and also allowing them to map out what they actually have. A lot of what companies have out there is unstructured data. So text, PDFs, audio, video, images, these are all really messy. These are very difficult to understand, and these have a lot of value, which AI is finally able to start unlocking. And now as people are exploring that, they need a layer of privacy in order to not only understand what information they collected that they need to be careful of and how much risk it carries, but also minimize that risk, especially as they're sharing this information across the organization, to have a more minute type of access control, if you will.
And Abigail, I know when we were talking earlier, you hit that choice note pretty hard as well. When that's something I was talking about. You're dealing with institutions who ultimately deal with patients. How does privacy play into kind of their interactions?
So, and thank you for letting me answer this from the perspective of health, because it is such a great microcosm of how things have changed around the world in such a short period of time and across all industries. In healthcare, what we see is that the demand for technology and digital health technology always outstrips the availability. So Canadians are ahead of the system 99% of the time. And we've made some fantastic gains since the start of the pandemic, because as a clinician out of UHN said last week, it was the ultimate change management tool. So what we see out there is Canadians expecting virtual visits, better access to their own information, the ability to get basic and more complex digital health services. And fortunately, that's always grown over time, but now the system is starting to keep up with them and starting to meet that demand, which is amazing. That demand is also strong, though, in other areas where we're still working toward meeting it. So if you think about remote monitoring technologies, Canadians expect to have the advantage of consumer devices in their home and be able to relate that and link that into their healthcare. And they're also starting to ask questions about AI and innovation. And this is a point I should acknowledge my colleague Simon Haggins, who leads our benefit evaluations team, and a really great academic team led by Dr. Nelson Shen we've been working with at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. We have been asking questions about Canadians' expectations for the health information for years, but we've more recently started getting really into what are expectations around some of those new technologies like AI and other innovations that Patricia was talking about. And that's where the picture gets a little more interesting, is how I'll put it. What we see there is that Canadians are less supportive, but that doesn't mean they don't want the benefits of it. It just means there are concerns. And I think we have to move our dialogue beyond the simplicity of saying, oh, I'm concerned about privacy, so stop. No, what that means is we have that opportunity to dialogue better and more clearly with the public to build that trust and build that support.
So on that point, Patricia, Abigail looks at this primarily from a health perspective. You have clients in a variety of sectors. What is, and you're a relatively new company, presumably set up to meet market demand. What is driving this demand? Is it different in particular sectors? Is it consumers? Is it regulatory? Where is it coming from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is somewhat different in particular sectors. It depends often whether a person's customer is viewing, or a company's customer is viewing the results of the data, or how strict the regulations are at actually enforcing data protection in a particular segment. So, for example, with regards to automatic speech recognition or conversational AI, a lot of the times when you're gathering data or when you're displaying data, it has to be PCI compliant. PCI compliance is very strict, and people need to be able to trust that the data that you're going to be sharing with them won't contain credit card information, won't contain social security numbers, things like that. When it comes to the healthcare space, there is already a very strong culture of compliance with regards to data protection. What we see a lot is people who want to comply with HIPAA and have a lot of information that they need to process at once. And so need to rely on artificial intelligence to do that because humans are not perfect. So what tends to happen is they'll use our technology to de-identify a bunch of documents and then bring a human in the loop to sample, do a statistical sample of the documents and make sure that nothing was missed in that sense. What we're seeing otherwise is a need for understanding the data, so quantifying risk, and that is more driven by regulators as well as CISOs and DPOs.
So just for those who aren't familiar with the space, so HIPAA is the U.S. Health privacy law, which we're going to talk about sort of jurisdictional issues later on, but that one comes up a lot. I wanted to go to Samara, you have a range of clients, and I'm interested in what you're seeing from them in terms of, where these issues around concern of privacy are particularly popping up.
So I think over the past 10 years, even less probably, there's been a huge shift in terms of what is driving people to get assistance with compliance, or how to use their data to meet their data ambitions. And we always start from that space. So we have a lot of people who come to us looking to understand what's happening in the environment. They're finding it confusing. We also have consumer demand. So what we're finding is that because there's been so much in the news, and we see breaches that are costly and bad for reputation, we have clients who then say, wait a second, our clients, our customers, they want this from us. They expect it from us. And they come to us because they do want to be that trustworthy organization that Pam was talking about. So there is, a desire, I think, from organizations who hold a lot of data, perhaps even not just those whose business is the data, but those who just happen to have a lot of data by virtue of being a business, because all of our businesses hold a lot of data these days. They're coming to us because they want to remain trusted by their customers. So I think in healthcare, there definitely is a culture of wanting to do the right thing. And when it comes to data, we're not always sure how to do that, or resourced in order to make sure that we catch everything in that sense. And Abigail, I'm sure, can speak more to that. But we do have certainly a foundation there. And I think partly in the private sector, this is starting to arise more than it had in the past. Whereas with healthcare, we kind of grew up with it and have had it for quite some time. And changes are being made right now to accommodate some of the changes in technology, to enable data sharing, to put the patient at the center of things. But certainly this is it's a new or emerging, I would say, market outside of the healthcare space for sure.
Abigail, I think this is your opening to talk about the work you've been doing around pharmacy and prescription, because I find that fascinating.
Yeah, it's a wonderful use case of the need to build those bridges. So we've talked about already a couple of examples where you've got that kind of a sort of segmentation or breaking that can happen when you look at the regulatory landscape. In healthcare, what we've seen is that level of regulation has sometimes, not through the legislation itself, but through the fear that can go with being regulated, resulted in impediments to moving forward with technology. So we've seen this certainly in the e-prescribing sector. So Infoway is, we deliver a service across the country. It's a very simple, in many ways, service. It's an e-prescribing service, but it's something that up until about 5 years ago hadn't taken hold in Canada the way it had in every other jurisdiction. And when we looked at why that is, we felt like it very strongly was coming out of these disparities in regulations or differences. It makes the landscape next to impossible sometimes, I think, for folks who want to innovate in technology to proceed. So, because if you think about what it is to work forward in healthcare, you're looking at commercial providers, so technology providers who are being governed by PIPEDA. You've got health service providers being most of the time governed by health-specific legislation. That's going to be different in every province across the country. You've got important social data trapped under public sector legislation, and not-for-profits who may not be regulated at all. And in healthcare, we want to bring all of that together so that there can be some common expectations. One of the challenges we saw early on as we were delivering our e-prescribing service is the need to be able to provide a common standard and a common approach that's going to meet the expectations of all of our participants, including Canadians. That's not a hard job to do, but it's not frequently done. And our regulatory framework isn't enabling it as strongly as it could right now. It's creating more of a barrier potentially than it is an enabler that Canadians expect.
So I want to work in a couple of audience questions because we've got them coming in already, and please keep them coming. a lot of you are working in these fields, and I only cover them, so your questions will be better than mine, I'm sure. A question from Alex Rosenblatt. What are the best ways for consumers to advocate for better privacy products from businesses? And it provides an example of privacy forms and how they can be structured. But I wanted to throw that to you, Samara, the question of how consumers how companies can sort of work privacy into products and have that dialogue with consumers.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question today. And you touched on this in your introduction when you were talking about the privacy fatigue and people interpreting, accepting as being that we don't care. It is really just a means to an end. We want to get to the product. What we're starting to advise people is more to embed those pieces along the way. So just in time notice, for instance. And, we're about to look at where you're located. Are you okay with that? Do you accept that? We need this information for X. Can we collect it? Or, expressing this throughout as opposed to in a dense privacy policy that you kind of have to sort through. And in that way, I think, there definitely are ways of embedding privacy decisions within products. Now, as far as advocating, you have to, unfortunately, individuals need to ask for it, and we have to get in touch and complain. I guess is really the only way to make this happen. There's also, a number of different organizations that you can get involved in, and where there are advocacy groups to talk about transparency. Getting in touch with some of the civil rights, Canadian Civil Liberties Association often advocates or gets in, intervenes in cases of this nature. So it's challenging. I would say it's a long road. There are from an individual perspective, but there definitely is a movement, I would say, in our advisory practice to help our clients to be more aware of the choices that are being made throughout the client or customer patient journey and asking for it just in time.
If I can make a comment there, I think one of the things I'm struck by, and I'm a consummate optimist, so I overlay that comment on this, what's to come. But I think the emphasis or the requirement for consumers to advocate is rapidly becoming eclipsed in the dialogue with provider organizations understanding that this can be an advantage to them. So it's less about quieting a concern and more about how do we take control of our data economy in ways that can help our businesses and serve Canadians. So it's less of a dichotomy of how do I deal with this thing? How do I address people's right, and more a recognition that consumers support having choices at the time they're useful that they can make use of. So it's not about needing, like in healthcare, it's obvious. It's not about advocating for your physician to be more private. Often it's about advocating for more technology in a way that supports your choices, which is a very different conversation.
Definitely, and two quick things here. One, a reminder to everyone on the call that actually organizations do have to provide certain amounts of information to you if you request it about yourself. So, James McLeod, formerly of the Financial Post, wrote this great story about Tim Hortons and the way that it was collecting his own personal data and what it was using it for based on a request that he made. Now, these things can take time, and sometimes companies have to involve people like Inc. To do that kind of work. But it is a right that you have, and one that you should exercise if you're interested in it. And secondly, that we will get to regulation in a second, but part of this new privacy bill that we're seeing is more controls around sharing and portability. So we'll get to that in a second, but I wanted to turn to another audience question from Peter Papadakos, which I wanted to ask you, Patricia. Do you recommend overlaying privacy within a data strategy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Privacy has to be integral to data strategy. So data strategy should first be a map of the data that you have, of the data that you want to collect. And privacy, what it's about, it's really about giving users control to what they want to done with their data. And if you want to be compliant with the GDPR and hopefully the upcoming Canadian legislation, it's really important to keep privacy and user control in mind when it comes to their data. And if you don't do that from the beginning within your data strategy, you're going to have a lot of headache down the line. And one other point I want to make is you need to have your data protection person really well integrated within what your technical teams are doing. And one of the companies that did this really well, led by Sheila Jambikar, who was their DPO at the time, is now the CPO at Plaid, is that they made it from the top down a responsibility and a mandate of the company to have privacy be everybody's concern within the organization. So the whole, if you see something, you say something, it's your responsibility as any developer in the company can bring up a concern with regards to privacy. And their data protection team thoroughly understood what technology was being built, what the concerns were, and what the outcomes required or desired from the technical teams were. And they worked hand in hand to make the technology that complies with privacy regulations and also satisfies business needs. So that makes the company much stronger in that sense.
Yeah, and Plaid is a really good example of one of these businesses that's built on data. That what it does is essentially connect different kinds of financial institutions so that consumers can have choice when they're using their data across organizations. Tamara, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add that the important thing, also one of the important things that you mentioned there, is that the business knew the outcomes that they wanted. And I think that's a really important thing to start with. What are your data ambitions? And it's the privacy program that supports the data ambitions, but they are integral to one another. And so there's sometimes a chicken and egg thing happening where we're brought in to say, what can we do? And we're like, well, what do you want to do? And that's sort of the conversation that happens a lot. Often I say, don't have privacy drive your data strategy, have it support your data strategy, because otherwise, we will err on the side of caution. We want to encourage we want to encourage sharing. And that means understanding your risk and taking risks according to what your business tolerance is and your data ambitions. So those are, they are very complementary, I would say, but we always go back and start with, what are the outcomes? What do you want to achieve? And I think that's a really important piece of this. I don't want to lose.
Yeah, and Abigail, you were speaking to this before, right? This idea of organizations not knowing what they can do and therefore being sort of put off from doing things that might be possible under the law, but that they're just not sure of. I mean, to frame this a little bit, I'm wondering how much consumer demand for specific outcomes, like I want to be able to be in a place where I don't have to I don't know what the use case is, get my imaging burned to CDs and then carry it to the next hospital. Like, how much of that is driving organizations to rethink the way that they're handling data?
Yeah, and that's a good thing, because I think Canadians' risk math, their risk management thresholds are often far more mature than our organizations are. And that's the way it should be, because I, as the consumer, am getting both the benefit, so I should have a role in understanding what risk I'm prepared to take. And I think we have often made the assumption that, especially as we see more and more breaches in the media, that the reaction of Canadians is going to be, well, don't do that. No, what we see in our data is that Canadians expect the benefits, so those positive outcomes, and they expect us to take care of business and do things in the right way. Like, we often talk about choice, but choice starts with knowing what's going on, knowing in a very accessible way what my choices are. And I'll pick up on something Samara was saying about those kind of just-in-time choice moments. My theoretical construct around privacy almost is less material than the calculation someone's going to make in the moment to say, is this use of information going to benefit me or benefit my community sufficiently to justify proceeding? Okay, let's go for it. And that doesn't mean they have to be immune or unaware of risk. I think we've got to give Canadians a bit more credit.
Yeah, and there's an interesting conversation happening, and maybe this is a chance to turn a little bit to the regulatory side around, meaningful consent and sort of pressured consent, right? are you giving consumers a real choice, or are you effectively saying we'll cut you off from services if you don't consent, and there's no other way to manage this transaction or this situation unless you consent to this data sharing that you might not be comfortable with? But this is sort of C27's klaxon. Just a little bit of background: C27 is the bill currently working its way through Parliament. It is not quite yet at second reading, but it is the bill that would replace PIPEDA, the 22, I believe now, year-old consumer privacy law, with a new Consumer Privacy Protection Act, as well as a couple of other bills that we might get to later. In brief, what it does is it changes the way the consent is managed. It changes. It's supposed to give consumers a little bit more control over data mobility, and it includes some exemptions for businesses for fairly standard business practices. All of that explanation itself would probably be disputed by some of the people who study this, but that's the brief overview. I wanted to start with a smallish piece of this whole regulatory landscape, which is the question of anonymization. It came up in all of our conversations. Patricia, what does anonymization mean, and why do sort of different definitions of it matter?
Yeah, so anonymization is really taking away the risk of re-identifying an individual from the data. So there is, in HIPAA, for example, there's HIPAA Safe Harbor, which lists different entity types that you need to remove, like names, exact locations, and so on, in order to limit the risk of re-identifying an individual. And it is the only regulation that actually provides a re-identification risk threshold, as far as I know, and that's 0.04% risk of re-identifying an individual. So you have to understand that it's never going to be perfect, but as we were saying, we have to calculate the benefits versus the risks. So the risk of re-identifying should be minimal, and oftentimes anonymization gets a really bad rep because people don't know what they're doing and make false claims. So you'll have people keep zip codes or postal codes, or keep other identifying information that is quasi-identifying, if you will. So it's not going to directly identify an individual, but when combining that information together, it can exponentially increase the risk of re-identification. An example would be keeping somebody's postal code, keeping their identified gender, keeping their phone number. All of these things increase the risk of re-identifying an individual. Even in a household of 20 people, that risk is already too high. So it's about really understanding the kind of data that you're dealing with, what kind of information you find in that data, the statistical information associated with each of the pieces of personally identifiable information, and what kind of outcomes you want to drive from that data once again. So in the case of the medical domain, you probably want to drive solid medical research. So you want to keep the personally identifiable information that's related to the protected health information. That is, you want to keep their medical conditions if it's not too identifying, maybe which hospital they visited, but you want to remove things like date of birth and maybe scale that back a bit.
And I guess to ask the other side of this, Samara, when you're working with clients, what does anonymization enable?
A lot of things. So one, sharing the data without having to be compliant with different data protection regulations. So GDPR, for example, does not apply to anonymized data. And that is a huge freedom for companies that are dealing with that. But also it enables limiting the risk. So data breaches are inevitable. And this is where data minimization and ideally data anonymization comes in. If you have a data breach as an organization and your data is made public, and you had anonymized the data set that had been made public, that is a headache in terms of maybe your moat is a little bit smaller as a business, but you are not going to have lost your users' trust, and you're not going to have to deal with data protection regulators in the same way as if the data were not anonymized.
Okay, so let's talk about fragmentation because this one comes up every time I cover this topic. Um, Samara, you've got clients, I imagine, who work on sort of all over the country and all over the world.
Mhm.
And there aren't even 13 laws in Canada. That would be too easy. Or 14, like 13 provinces and territories and one federal. There's like some mishmash. We've got a new federal law. We've got new laws popping up in different provinces and territories. How do you keep all of this straight? Do you have a spreadsheet? Can I borrow the spreadsheet? How do you handle this?
Yeah, and then adding to that is that it always depends on the facts of the situation. So we do have a lot of fragmentation, and you can even hear kind of internationally as Patricia's talking, in GDPR and in HIPAA and this, there's so just looking at Canada itself, though all of our laws are essentially based on the federal PIPEDA law, or at least have the same principles, whether or not they've been deemed substantially similar. You still have to comply with the nuances if you're working in multiple provinces. And so this is something that comes up, and we advise governments and agencies all the time on some of these things, as well as private sector companies who operate in every province and need to understand what their role is. So we have role-based legislation a lot in the healthcare sector, at least. And in those spaces, you have to make sure that your role is well defined and that you're complying with your obligations in each province. And so it creates a very complex network. And often right now we are seeing that the roles are not so easily defined. Often, organizations, companies are playing multiple roles, and so it makes it even more complex for complying with those rules. And then, how we align internationally is also kind of a different question. We see Quebec that is moving more towards a GDPR type of law, whereas arguably, and I'm sure others, people can disagree on this, we have federal law that is moving or remaining more of a consent-based legislation rather than a rights-based one. And so we, even within our own borders, where we can't agree on what the right approach is, and every province sort of feels that they have the answer for their own population, and it does create quite a complex web for agreeing on how to share information across borders, across Canada, even within a province itself.
Just quickly, could you explain what you mean by roles there? Like, what are we
Yeah.
talking about?
So, I'll give healthcare is typically role based, and what I mean by that is you have to establish what your legislative role is. So, are you a health information custodian? If yes, then you can do these things. Are you a health information network provider? That's another role we have in Ontario. Then you can do these things. And so defining what role you play. In some provinces, there's the concept of information manager. So, and then there are specific clauses in agreements that must be in place in those provinces if you're an information manager or using an information manager. So these are just some of those little nuances that are really dependent upon the role that you're playing in the province in order to comply and define what you can and can't do with data.
Abigail, I mentioned this is your day to day.
I was just going to
How
say
do
thank you
deal
for
with this?
thank you for letting me jump in on that, because I think this is one of our calls to action right now, is to address this, because as difficult as it is for businesses to navigate, it to me is it's very clear that it's unreasonable to expect a Canadian to have a knowledge of how to navigate this. So it's a certain impracticality. I think it's bad enough that we'll get beyond it, because the reality of how health information, but information broadly, is handled is that it no longer sits in a way that a single custodian, a hospital or physician, can truly shape or dictate how information is handled if it's in the hands of a large technology provider or other organization. They can shape that by choosing reliable, good providers, but their ability to control how information is handled is less perhaps than the information technology provider themselves. But our laws are still sitting all the risk and all the weight of regulation and the burden of regulation, with that health services provider. So I think there's an opportunity to do some shifts in how we think about these things.
And so we are heading towards time, but there's a couple of last points I want to get to before we go. One is Neil Thompson's question, which is, I guess this is probably what all of you do every day, but what level of transparency or privacy provides a business advantage and or minimization sufficient to cover costs? I.e., what is that risk reward ratio? Where does it sit?
If I can maybe start, I think part of the challenge is that language still thinks of it as an overlay, this additional burden of cost that, okay, you're going to build your rocking technology and then you're going to sit privacy on top of it. And I think, again, our opportunity is to shift our perspective on that and to think about how choice points, consumer choice points, are just baked right into the system or service. So it's not a compliance cost. It's simply a part of how a technology operates. Because my personal opinion is, if you conceptualize it that way, it's not about a line that we're going to hit or a ceiling that we're going to hit, but rather, again, trying to understand, like we do in every other area of our business, what do our consumers want, whether they're a healthcare patient or a commercial consumer, what do they want and how do we deliver against it?
That's a
Patricia?
great point.
Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry.
sorry. I just wanted to say that was a great point. And I think that was my challenge in the question is, what costs are you talking about? But I think that's just it, right? It's the conceptualization of privacy as an additional cost as opposed to one that's baked in. And the level of transparency to your business advantage is, really dependent on your business. It's sort of that one is a challenging one to answer.
And I'd add to that, agree, very good point. It's integrating privacy and transparency into your practices means that you understand your data better. So you are better able to face any data breaches that are very likely to occur. You're better faced to use that data to your advantage as your business grows. So it's a lot of benefits, and the cost of integrating it is something that you'll have to do down the line anyway. So might as well think of it sooner rather than later.
So just as we let these fine people watching us go, I want to ask you all to leave them with sort of one 2023 thing, whether that's a way to adapt to C27 before it, as we see it work its way through, an opportunity that they should be ready to grasp, preparation for the next breach, whatever it is, one concrete thing to go away and do, maybe not today, but tomorrow or later through this year. And Samara, why don't we start with you?
The one thing I would say is know what data you have. And that's sort of the foundational piece of all of the privacy programs and business ambitions, data ambition. Knowing what you have, where it's stored, how it's used is going to save you a lot of headaches down the road, but it'll also provide you with a lot of opportunities as well.
Abigail?
That's you will have figured out by now that I never constrain myself to a thought, but I'm going to try on this one. And if people will indulge me, I'll harp on that notion of transparency. When we think about the next stage that we need to get to in healthcare, as an example, it's about the broader use of health information. It relies on getting a benefit out of that data, not just for me as an individual, but as a community. Enabling the use of information for better planning, for great AI tools that can help not only me, but help others like me in their care. And if we're going to get support of Canadians around those objectives, we need to talk to them more about what does that look like in plain language with great concrete examples. So I suppose my one thing is to stop using privacy speak and to start talking about, in a very plain language way, what are you doing with my data and what can I do about it? And what is just part of a tool set? Like, you didn't ask my consent about a fax machine, but you certainly did ask about where my information needed to go to support my care. So I think we have an opportunity to take a layer of, whether you call it privacy language or legalese, off of this conversation and have some really good, accessible conversations about how information is used in this country, how it can be used, and where we want to go together.
Patricia?
I'm going to reiterate my point about having your data protection team well integrated into your technical team. I've seen too often data protection officers that are there to stamp papers or say no, but they don't know what the data map's actually like. They don't know what kind of things the technical teams are really wanting to do with the data. And that is just an incredibly impractical way to run your business.
Certainly a lot of emphasis on talking to each other, and I think that that's what we've been doing today, and that's a thing for all of you to go out and do with the rest of your year. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. Thank you to our speakers, Abigail Carter-Langford, Chief Privacy and Security Officer and Executive Vice President of Governance, Risk, and Compliance. Boy, you have a long business card at Canada Health Infoway. Samara Starkman, partner at INQ Law and INQ Consulting, and Patricia Thaine, co-founder and CEO of Private AI. Thank you again to our partner TELUS for making this event possible and for your continued support, and to Pam Snively for her remarks on the state of data privacy in Canada at the top. Thank you all watching for joining us today. Subscriber support means a lot to us at The Logic, and it's what allows us to continue to produce in-depth journalism. If you're not already a subscriber, you can find a link to subscribe in the chat or visit The Logic's website. Thank you to The Logic's business team who make all of this possible. I am just the talking head. And to our technical producer, John Packman, for all the behind-the-scenes work. Truly, none of us could get through any of this without the team behind us. We're eternally grateful for all the work that they put in. We have an exciting roster of exclusive events planned for 2023, so keep your eyes on your inbox for upcoming invites. And if you enjoyed today's event, we're hosting an in-person subscriber meetup in Ottawa on February 8th, where you'll have the chance to meet some of our team, including me, and make new connections. There's also a slide I have promised to go down it, but we'll see if I live up to that promise. If you want to secure your spot on the guest list, feel free to email events@thelogic.co today, please. Thank you again to our partner TELUS and to our speakers who made this such an informative chat. You can find The Logic on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Have a great day.